I was in Building 10 from 1977 through 1979. I was working in the lab of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Paul Cradian, who was truly a man ahead of his time. He was a surgeon who had trained at Memorial Sloan Kettering, who had a real basic fundamental understanding of immunology. And at that time, immunology was very, very rudimentarily understood, not what we know as immunology today. And so we got involved in a protocol that allowed us to do the first positive immunotherapy trial in the world that was run out of my lab. It actually had started and was completed by the time I got there. And then I had the opportunity to do the first ever immunotherapy trials in human beings with glioblastoma. Until the 70s, really the only way you could cure cancer was to operate on it. And Vince DeVita, who, by the way, was president of the American Cancer Society later on, was the first person to cure cancer with chemotherapy. He cured Hodgkin's disease with chemotherapy, and that was done in Building 10. And by coincidence, the very first paper that I published, it was an abstract actually, was with Dr. DeVita. So here it is 40 years later, and I've gotten to know Dr. DeVita much better now than I even knew him when I was at the NCI. But there's a lot of cross-linkage between the American Cancer Society and the National Cancer Institute. When I was there were two corridors. One corridor housed our labs, and the adjoining corridor held our patients. So we knew immediately when we got there that what we were doing in that lab was incredibly important to trying to save those people's lives. And so every day when you went to the lab, you weren't just going to a lab and working with mice or looking under a microscope or using a cell counter or whatever it was you were doing. You understood when you saw those patients who were suffering with their cancers that what you were doing in the lab in the next corridor, 20 feet away, would impact potentially on their lives and allow their families to see them maybe somewhat longer than they would have. So the juxtaposition of the lab and the patient was so important to us, and it really drove home the point that research is the answer to trying to solve this problem of cancer. It's very easy to take things like the NIH and for the American Cancer Society for granted. It's always been there, quote unquote, always been there. But it won't, these institutions like the NIH won't always be there unless there's a public outcry to support it. There are people that come to Building 10 who have exhausted all other therapies. And that's one of the things that it was famous for, and it's one of the things it is famous for. Taking on problems that other institutions and other doctors had no answers for. And that takes a different kind of individual, different kind of doctor to want to do that. To do clinical trials on diseases and for people who may have no other option. And that we should admire that, and we should honor that. And so we shouldn't have to fight for dollars to make sure that the NIH, and especially from my perspective, the National Cancer Institute, ever has to worry about where the dollars are coming from. So the advice that I have to the American public is make sure you talk to your congressmen and your senators and make sure they understand that, because your children and your grandchildren and you will be directly affected by what goes on in Building 10.